to,
Hello and welcome to The Ordinary Show, a show about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm Cheryl Brown, your host, and today we're going to talk to somebody extraordinary. We have with us in our studio today John MacDougall, and he's going to share with us his thoughts and passions and concerns about climate change, social justice, and transportation. But we're not going to take up most of the time. We're going to allow John to tell us a little bit about himself to share with you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, I should first explain I'm from across the pond. I was born and raised in England. I came to this country to go to grad school and fell in love. And my late wife and I must have been in this country for, in my case, over 45 years. And I retired from teaching at UMass Lowell in the sociology department. What I then did was move to Cambridge, and I really enjoy Cambridge hugely. I have 3 grandchildren here, which is wonderful, and 2 grown kids and their spouses. And I've got very concerned about climate, as has, I'm sure, many in the viewing audience. And I'm particularly concerned about the transportation aspect of that. And in point of fact, if I may quickly check my notes here,
Sure.
Cheryl kindly got us some information on the web too,
Yes,
which we can
and
show.
while you're checking your notes.
So the transportation sector accounts for about 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions here in Massachusetts. And unfortunately, that particular sector has done way worse than other parts of the economy, for example, electricity generation. And in fact, here in this state, the emissions of greenhouse gases from transportation are actually up compared to levels that they were at in 1990, which is different from other sectors like electricity and building use. And also, as I'm sure we all know, the one-person car is a real disaster from the greenhouse gas emissions. There are other considerations I'll get to in a minute. For example, if you take the US as a whole, the statistics on the website from the US Department of Transportation that you can see in a moment, that shows that if you take a one-person car, compare that with right here in Massachusetts, here we do have numbers for this state, a heavy rail, which means things like the Red Line, then the private car is about 3 times as bad in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. If you look at light rail, like the Green Line, cars are even worse, 4 times as bad. And then even a bus, unfortunately, a bus is quite old here, mostly on the MBTA, but a bus is about 1 1/3 times as bad. So from a greenhouse gas standpoint, one-person cars are just bad news, as I'm sure many of us know. There's also, to my mind, if I can just add quickly, Cheryl,
sure.
there's a whole issue of equity here. And in urban areas particularly, of course, low-income people, they are much, much more dependent on transit. Simply, they cannot afford a car. It's that straightforward. And there's a recent study you may have seen reported on the Boston Globe that across cities in the United States, the key obstacle for for low-income folks to getting ahead, especially between generations, the key obstacle is lack of access to transit. So, it plays a very important role in social equity. I know by many in the viewing audience, I, for one, was very much struck in all the snowstorms this winter, seeing those long, long lines when the MBTA had to suspend service on the Red Line and other lines, and people waiting for shuttle buses in the freezing cold, and that must have been utterly miserable. Fortunately, I was spared that. And I'm sure most of those people in line were middle-income, low-income folks. The rich among us could still, I'm sure, get in their limos. So that's the background, if I may. I'd like to talk just a little bit to you, Cheryl, and the audience about some of the background right here in Massachusetts. I'm sure we're all aware of the Big Dig, and that imposed huge costs and financial costs, and also, I think, sapped energy, creative energy, from transportation planners, from entrepreneurs, and so on, paying for that. And of course, we still pay for that as we ride on the subways and so on. And recently, so that's led to a huge backlog of repairs. And in February, the MBTA estimated that to fix the cars, the signal systems, and so on would cost $6.7 billion, not a small amount of money. Then there was an act, as I'm sure many people know, in 2013, that did try to fix things. And that provided for basically $600 million a year for 5 years as by way of state subsidy to pay for public transportation, to pay for pedestrians, to pay for bike facilities. And in addition to that, this act capped the fare increases at 5% maximum increase every 2 years. And of course, there's a major equity aspect there. And this was going to get paid for primarily by raising the gas tax by 3 cents a gallon. So that went through. It's more or less in place. But I think we also need to look at the statewide politics, not just right here in the Boston area. And from my experience, and I'm sure many viewers have seen this too, if you go outside metropolitan Boston, you'll find lots of legislators, you'll find lots of citizens and citizen groups who are really ticked off at what's going on in this particular part of the state, thinking that all the emphasis is on fixing the MBTA, all the political energy goes into dealing with the problems of the T, and of course at one point there was a proposal actually to raise the sales tax statewide only to pay for the T, which seems to me one of the dumbest public policies that could have been thought of. And of course, when you get outside the Metro Boston area, there are many cities and towns totally dependent on a car, no access whatever to transit. And even if they do have a local transit system, it's often very inadequate. There's no service on weekends and evenings, for example. And then even on our roads, we have huge numbers of bridges that are deficient. The American Society for Civil Engineers estimated that almost 2,000 of our bridges on our highways are structurally deficient and need to be fixed. So you have this huge backlog. As I said, here on the T, just to give you one example, 60% of the subway cars here on the Red Line are already beyond their useful life, which was measured at 25 years. They need to be replaced immediately. So then as I'm sure lots of people know, there was lots of controversy because we had to shut down the subways and bus services, not only during snowstorms, but for days following. And the governor appointed a special panel, which reported in April. What that panel did was firstly to mention that there are all kinds of problems with mismanagement in the management or lack of management on the T. And personally, I think there's a lot of truth to what's been said. However, some of those statistics are questionable. For example, there's been quite a bit of controversy about the number of absentee days taken by workers on the MBTA. And the numbers, if you read the report, do include absentee days because of sickness, because of jury duty, military duty, which seems to me is in no way something that you can criticize the workers on the T as being a bunch of lazy characters. They were taking totally legitimate absences from work. Now, it's interesting, the governor's panel, in addition to talking about mismanagement, did talk about the need for revenue, which is a key part of the current debate. Then the governor, more recently, has submitted a bill, which is make its way through the legislature. And this bill stresses the mismanagement aspect. In fact, I'll get to it in a moment, says essentially nothing about revenue. What the bill does say that's most prominent is the proposal for a special fiscal control board to specifically manage the problems on the T, separate from the statewide Department of Transportation. And this would be in place for 3 years, possibly as much as 5 years. In addition, what the governor's bill wants to do is to remove this 5% cap on fare increases that I mentioned. And going beyond that, the governor's bill actually, in reality, what it is doing is to cut the amount of state subsidy available to the T by approximately $100 million a year for a space of 5 years. So, you know, the report was talking about getting revenue as something really important to do. Nevertheless, the bill has said, no, we need to cut the amount of money available to the T. So I'm sure people are thinking, well, what should we do? And I'll give you my own laundry list for what it's worth. For the short term, I certainly agree that we need some management reforms like the governor's bill is proposing. That's fine. However, I'm very strongly opposed to eliminating this fare cap. The fare cap, as I mentioned, is a key way to really make public transit affordable on a sustained basis for all kinds of low-income folks, disabled folks. There's also a whole controversy we could get into about the ride for disabled people. And so this 5% cap should stay in place. Also, I'm against this cut that I mentioned. In reality, less $500 million a year reduction in funding for the MBTA. But I think we need to go beyond that. And I think right now we should start to change the public discourse. We need to start saying, no, we need to have big revenue increases. And this is because, obviously, as I mentioned, public transit, particularly, but also obviously biking and walking, that does fantastic things for greenhouse gases, as I mentioned. But in addition to that, there are other benefits which I'm sure lots of people are aware of. There are public health benefits. You know, even if you take a bus or a subway, let's say, to get to work or to go to school, you frequently have to walk, say 10, 15 minutes. Well, that's excellent exercise. Whereas if you drive your car, you go to your garage or go to the street and you just sit in your car the whole way. So there are real public health benefits. In addition, there are all kinds of issues which maybe we can discuss, Cheryl and I were discussing before the show, having to do with safety. And if we can design our streets, and fortunately some really good things are happening right here in Cambridge and Boston, we can design our streets to be a lot safer. And it's striking that actually in the city of Boston, there is now a new commitment by the mayor, only within the last few weeks, for what he calls Vision Zero. And Vision Zero means a commitment to 0 fatalities on the streets of Boston for traffic crashes. And it's going to take perhaps a while to get there, but I think that's a wonderful thing to do, and hopefully we can do that in Cambridge as well. So that's one of the safety benefits. Obviously, there are the job creation benefits, particularly if you cluster development close to subway and bus nodes and commuter rail nodes, what's called transit-oriented development. So there are all these benefits, but they're going to cost. Not to mention the fact that, of course, cities like Cambridge, areas just down the street like Kendall Square are expanding like crazy, and more people are riding. But interestingly, in Kendall Square, even though there are more people living and working there, the amount of use of transit has also gone up. There are many more cyclists, for example, And so the congestion on the roads is actually not really changed in Kendall Square because, at least here in Cambridge, we've had some really good planning for transit access. But we still lack the sufficient number of cars and updated cars for our transit system. So, as I say, we need to work on this as not only changing the conversation right now, but to my mind, trying to come up with some new revenue sources, which I'll get to in a moment. And also, as I mentioned, the equity issue, I think we need to fix the existing problems immediately because that is something that low-income folks need. They need reliable bus service. They need trains that don't get stuck in tunnels because the cars are 40, 50 years old. All of those things really have to come to an end. So I've also been thinking about some revenue sources. A lot of people have thought about this as well. So if I may, I'd like to mention just 3 different things that could be done, each of which would generate about 500 to 600 million a year. And that would go quite a ways to not only fixing the repairs, but some new expansions. For example, a pet project I would love to see is to link the blue line to the red line by having a link directly from Bowdoin Station on the blue line to Charles Street MGH just across the river on the red line. So you could raise the gas tax. This was raised back in 2007. If you raised it 11.5 cents a gallon, then that would get you 500 to 600 million a year. Secondly, what you could do is you could have tolls on all the interstates across the state, not just the Mass Pike. And if that was 5 cents a mile, that would generate about 550 million a year, the same amount of money roughly. And apparently, the average cost to a commuter, for example, going on the Pike from the western tolls into downtown Boston, that's, I think I got it right, $4 a day to a commuter. So it isn't really going to have any impact on the average commuter. Certainly if you're now driving, if you were to be driving on 93, for example, that doesn't have a toll, then you would have to pay a toll. No question about that. So it does come out of somebody's pockets. But I think we have to start thinking of that. And then the third source that I think we need to start thinking about is what's called a vehicle miles traveled tax. So now with electronic technology, you can easily track the number of miles that your car does every year, and you then send them a bill. And for example, if that was 1 cent a mile, only 1 cent a mile, that would again, according to some estimates that have been done, come to about $500 to $600 million a year. So there's all of this that we should start thinking about when it comes to revenue. And then, of course, this involves politics, and politics statewide, because it would need statewide legislative approval. And it seems to me that one thing that we need to emphasize, and I'm all in favor of this personally, is that it's not just transit, but as I mentioned earlier, all these deficient bridges that are going to cost multi-million dollars to fix over the long term, they absolutely need to be fixed. You know, there's one bridge already in Springfield that's in terrible shape, and there are plans to fix that on I-91,
So
but there's much more of that. So that's basically it. Yes,
a
Cheryl.
good opportunity to show the people a way
Right.
that they can get involved.
Right.
So from
Okay.
the information, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
because
Thank you, Cheryl.
It's so valuable.
Yeah.
And those are talking points that people need to be informed of.
Right, definitely.
So let's just take a look at some of these
Okay.
other ideas
Right.
from one of the suggested websites, fta.dot.gov.
Right. By the way, that's the U.S. Department of Transportation.
U.S. Department of Transportation. And I just extrapolated some of the main points.
Excellent.
One of the main points is the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure if you touched on that yet, but the national level data shows significant greenhouse gas emission savings by use of public transportation, which
Right.
is what you touched on.
Right.
And also taking from your talk from the Transportation Working Group.
Oh, right. That's, if I can just interject for a moment, that's one thing, sort of wearing my activist hat, in 350 Mass, which will be on the
Yeah,
website
we're
in a
going to go
moment,
to that.
we
Yeah,
have
the
a small
major,
group working on transportation, and I made a little speech about that
Yes.
on behalf of 350
and the
Mass,
major
yes.
reforms that you emphasize needed
Right.
for MBTA, also legislation to empower municipalities to raise taxes and fees to fund transportation improvements.
Right. Can I interject for a moment on that,
Yes.
Cheryl? It's very interesting. There is actually a bill in the legislature, not the follow-up to the governor's panel, but a different bill, which would allow municipalities and regions to hold referenda of their own. And if those referenda went through, they would be empowered to raise some kind of tax, some kind of fee, which they would then use to fund specific transportation improvements in their own areas. And that makes tons of sense.
Right. And you also recommended fta.dot.gov.
Right, yes.
And they have an excellent website that I
Right.
visited, and they have a little video that we'll show in a moment.
Oh, great.
And FTA Reports is another recommendation.
Right.
Now there's Livable Streets. Did you want to mention
Yes, that's a
anything
great
about
organization.
Livable
They have an office just down the street on Pacific Street, actually.
Okay.
They are some of the leading advocates for these issues like safety and public health. And Cheryl and I were talking just over the bridge, for example, over the BU Bridge. There's a stretch of Commonwealth Avenue where the mayor of Boston is actually going to implement his Vision Zero, total, no vehicle fatalities, hopefully. And the city of Boston has redesigned the streets so there are special barriers between the traffic lanes and cycle tracks. And then beyond the cycle tracks, there is pedestrian areas. So, and this happens all over Europe. We have a little bit of it. I think it's here in Vassar Street, a short stretch here in Cambridge. But to me, that's really the best
that's
practice.
gonna be
And
valuable.
Livable Streets has done wonderful work in advocating for that. Some other places, the McGrath Highway as that gets taken down in Somerville. So
Okay.
they've done some really good work.
And also,
transportation,
Massachusetts has
yeah.
an excellent website.
Right. Transportation for Massachusetts is a coalition of all kinds of different organizations. Our 350 Mass Group belongs, Livable Streets, but interestingly, a number of planning agencies across the state. There's one, I think, in the Berkshires. I know there's one in the Pioneer Valley, in Springfield, Amherst, that area. So they're part of it. Right here in the Boston area, there's an interesting controversy people may have seen in the Boston Globe about the governor's proposal. And there's an organization, for example, called A Better City, ABC. And they represent some major businesses in the Boston area, also big nonprofits like hospitals and universities. And they are very much advocating for more revenue. They're not saying, oh, it's a big burden on business. No, they recognize the economic and I'm sure the climate and the social equity
Well,
benefits.
that's an interesting concept. What your 3 suggestions as to how to raise revenue
Right.
involve some pretty huge steps, not just for legislation, because we know legislation kind of comes from grassroots.
Right.
And getting people to agree to increase taxes,
Right.
increase tolls,
Right.
an increase on fees.
Right.
Do you have a magic hat or
I wish I had a magic wand, yes.
wand?
I wish I could be the dictator. No, never. No. We got rid of one king in England. I'm glad he went.
Do you have any comment on how the people will receive that and get behind this movement?
Good question. Well, one thing I
It's
can
like
say is,
going to the dentist. We know it's necessary, but we don't
Right.
make extra appointments.
we definitely do not. Right.
So-
Well, public opinion polls do show that when you talk to the public about taking money out of their pockets, I'll be honest, that's what it's about. But if you say that that is in exchange for some very visible and clearly, obvious public benefit, like good transportation, like, reducing greenhouse gases, for example, but also safety, creating jobs, all those good things I mentioned. When you make clear that these benefits are definitely going to accrue in return for the increased taxes or fees, then the public will get behind the taxes and fees. So, it's perhaps not so hard to make that case, but nevertheless, it has to be made.
It has to be made. Just throwing that out there.
Sure.
Devil's advocate,
Yeah.
as they sometimes say.
Definitely, yeah.
So I'm just looking at some of the websites. I pulled up the government, United States Department of Transportation site
Right.
first, and now we're on Livable Streets,
Right,
who have an excellent website,
right,
Rethinking Urban Transportation.
right. And by the way, from that website, there's some page where you can also find out about some best practices around the world, too.
Oh, okay.
Not just outside the U.S.
Speaking
in
of
the
around
US.
the world,
Yes,
350 here.
right, yes,
They have 188 countries involved. If you
right.
visit this website and go to the bottom, it shows you a map, 350 global map.
Oh,
Around
great.
the world.
Yeah,
so
Right.
you're not alone. I know a lot of universities, their students are right here, as you can see.
Yep.
They're advocating for divestment.
Oh, divesting fossil
from
fuels,
fossil
right. Just down the
fuels.
road in Harvard, they
Yeah,
had
we
a
just-
big protest
just
about
had
that
a big-
about a month ago.
And
Yep.
many other colleges have already done this, so.
Right. Right.
And this is an excellent website,
Transportation for Massachusetts, right.
Yeah.
And one thing I really like about that site is if you go to, I think it's called Resources,
Yes. Mhm.
and they can give you the governor's special panel report, which I mentioned, and some of their own reports, of course, too. And some of this goes back into history because there have been lots of people writing all kinds of reports about what's wrong with our transit system and transportation system. So they're really good at Transportation for Massachusetts in terms of making these reports readily accessible. You don't have to dig around in some obscure, government or other agency website.
Oh, okay.
So that's good. Can I quickly mention a couple
Sure.
of things coming up? Because people may be asking what they need to do.
Sure.
Thank you, Cheryl. One thing I would recommend that people do is contact your legislators about the governor's bill. Maybe you accept what I've been saying, agree with what I've been saying. Maybe you have other views, but I think it's important that our representatives know. I actually had a very good conversation with my state representative, Marjorie Decker, and she was extremely helpful. We had a very fruitful conversation. So, these legislators for representing us in Cambridge, I'm glad to say, I think every single one of them are really helpful.
Do you have like one or two sentences that the constituents should lead with as to what they want their legislators to put as a priority?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I can get to that. I also want to mention another event.
Okay.
Yes, what I would say is that I think what constituents should do is talk about their own personal concerns, your own personal experience with the T, maybe with